In this lecture, we'll talk about the immediate effects that World War II had on the United States economy, the Texas economy, and also how politics begins to change in Texas post-Cold War. We'll also talk about the growing labor movement in Texas and Texas government resistance to that labor movement as well. The first thing that we'll talk about is the fact that we talked before about the fact that the Depression had just ended, and it really was because of World War II that gets America out of the Great Depression. This time period, in the late 40s, early 50s, is known as like the golden age of capitalism. All kinds of new innovations are coming about, like television and the air conditioner. Hello, the air conditioner. Can you imagine living in the South without the air conditioner, right? And so conveniences become a big thing. Consumer culture really grows, very similar to what happened in the 20s. We see this consumer culture grow as well. So things begin to change, positively innovations wise and economically as well. With this changed economy, though, we also have a group of veterans that are coming home post-World War II. So if we think about this, in 1945, you have 12 million Americans that were in the military coming home, and they want to know that they have a job, that they have a future. And so before they even came home, in 1944, FDR had pushed through a GI Bill, which is still in effect today. And actually, many of you may be going to school on the GI Bill because of your own GI benefits or from the GI benefits from your family. This is known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. That's the official name of it. It gave financial aid to those attending colleges, loans, and it does encourage a huge amount of vets to come in and to take advantage specifically, not just of like home loans, but also college. So in Texas itself, on the job training, technical school, apprenticeships, it gave you a monthly stipend while vets were attending school, and gave them, benefits to buy home loan at a low interest, like I mentioned. Just to put this in perspective, only 10% of Americans attended college in 1938, and there were only about 160,000 that were attending schools. When World War II ends with the GI Bill, 500,000 people are attending school by 1950, so a very significant amount of people that are coming home. Unfortunately, the GI Bill and the benefits, if you were a person of color, was different depending on region. So initially, many men of color and women do take up the GI Bill to attend different colleges throughout the nation. However, the GI Bill is distributed locally. That meant that the local regional places had control over who would get the GI Bill and who would not. So in the North, we see a lot of African American black men going to college increasing. And we also see people of color being able to move from a status they might have had of a lower class status economically to a higher class status. In the South, however, those Jim Crow laws restricted African Americans and Mexican Americans from being able to realize the full potential of the GI Bill. And what this does is it creates a greater divide economically between whites and people of color, more so than there was before this. And so in the next lecture, not this one, but the next one, I'm going to specifically talk about the American GI Forum that was created by Hector Garcia, Dr. Hector Garcia, to address specifically Mexican Americans and GI Bills and their rights post-war. Now, politics in Texas post-Cold War, Coke Stevenson was the governor of Texas before or during the World War II, and he's going to continue to after that. He was a pretty popular governor, mainly because of his fiscal responsibility. It still was mainly a one-party system. There were factions, however, within the party. So there's a group of, and let me move myself out of the way so you can kind of read this. But there was a group of Democrats during this time known as the Texas Regulars. They were a conservative group within the Democratic Party. They were Southern, but they considered themselves Southern Democrats in Texas, and they were created in 1936 specifically to oppose FDR's New Deal. Now, FDR actually is elected 4 times as president. I think I mentioned the last time that's the reason today we have a constitutional amendment limiting that, because the only reason FDR left office was because he died, and that's how Truman became president. But we see these like liberal versus conservative factions within the Democratic Party, which will eventually split the party. There was also another group of wealthy oil executives that funded a group called the Committee for Constitutional Government. And I do want you to take a look at this image here. This is a full page ad. I'm moving myself out of the way here. This is a full page ad that was taken out by the Texas regulars. And you can see what they mainly focused on, right? They don't like the fact that labor unions are involved, and also the fact that desegregation has started to be talked about. Just to put this a little bit in perspective, too, in 1948, Truman desegregated the military. And that is really significant because now we have an integrated force. Our first conflict with an integrated armed force is going to be the Korean War. So you can pause this if you didn't already take a look at it and see this ad. I think this was might have been a Fort Worth paper. What does it say there? Yeah, Bartlett Tribune, Bartlett, Texas. Okay, so it's got the information there, and there's a link to there if you want to take a look at that a little bit more carefully. Now, I do want to talk about the rise of labor unions. And I'm going to back up a little bit because I need to explain what was happening with labor unions. Because before this time period, moving myself out of the way here again, before this time period, late 1800s, we talked about this when we talked about the Gilded Age, labor unions were really seen in a very, very negative light. And unfortunately, you can almost say labor unions still have that view by many Americans today. But FDR really kind of changes this view a little bit, and this huge bill that was passed called the Wagner Act, the formal name is the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, which basically allowed people to join unions. It used to be that employers would refuse to hire you if you joined a labor union, or you'd be fired. So the Wagner Act stopped that. So labor unions greatly increased because of this. In Texas itself, they were mainly part of 2 of the big labor unions, either the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor, or the CIO, which is the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, it's going to later merge those 2 groups. Today, they're merged together. But in Texas, the CIO is more politically active than the AFL. The AFL was afraid to be associated with communism, which the Red Scare is also kind of a thing, right, at this time, the Cold War. We'll talk about that in the next lecture as well. But essentially, the Texas CIO, they're the ones that are more politically active. They helped establish local organizations. As a matter of fact, the one that was probably most politically active was OWIU, a local oil union group within the CIO. It became the 2nd largest local CIO organization, and the image here is of a strike. And like I mentioned, generally speaking, labor unions are viewed pretty negatively. But just as 13 years of the Wagner Act, then we see a huge pushback by conservatives against labor unions. And the culmination of that came out with the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948. So its formal name is the Labor Management Relations Act. President Truman actually vetoed it. He did not want this. Okay, he vetoed this bill. Move myself out of the way there again. But Congress overrode the veto. I want you to think about how significant that is, okay? Because in order to get an overriding of a presidential veto, you need 2/3 of Congress to do that. It doesn't happen much in U.S. history, but it does happen. So what does it do, right? It restricts certain types of strikes, secondary boycott, closed shops, which meant that you could not join or work for a company unless you joined a union. And on top of that, this is again this time period of the Cold War. People are afraid of communism. Communism is associated with labor unions, unfortunately. And so they had to sign loyalty oaths if you did belong to a union. It also does this thing talking about the right to work states. It gave states the right to form right to work states. Texas is a right to work state, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But it opens up this kind of can of worms regarding restrictions on labor unions. So union membership, just to kind of put this in perspective, in Texas actually grew to 225%. That was the most of any other southern state, which in reality, it wasn't the majority of Texans that worked anyway. It was only about 10% of the workers that were actually belonging to unions, even with this big jump. There were organizations that tried to stop labor unions. There was a couple of them called the Christian American Association. They were funded by groups to push for these right to life or right to work legislation, and the Fight for Free Enterprise, which was actually founded in San Antonio. These are kind of conservative organizations. And so there were a slew of laws that are anti-union that come about right at the same time as Taft-Hartley. One was an open shop, which basically said that you didn't have to join a union, but it also forbade public employees from striking. If you ever wondered why teachers in Texas don't strike because of the pay, it's because it's a right to work state, and teachers can actually lose their teaching license, and so they can't work in Texas as a teacher if they join in these strikes. A right to work law was passed. Basically, to understand right to work just a little bit, backers of right to work laws, they actually claim that these laws protect workers against being forced to join a union. But in reality, this is a federal law that already makes it illegal for people to do that. So there wasn't any need to create something like this. These laws actually just make it harder for working people to form unions and to collectively bargain for, better wages, better pay, and things like that. So to get a visual on what states are right to work states, this gives you kind of visual of it. This shows you the states that are right to work states, and local right to work laws might exist in Delaware, but you can see it's pretty regional, right? The South and some parts of the West as well. All right, so let's talk about women and what happens with women during this time period. Just to put this kind of in perspective, remember that the last time we talked about women, it was kind of celebratory, right? Because women make up a third of the workforce during World War II, but women are actually going to be set back into this private sphere during this time period. There was a pressure to preserve this American way of life, to form this nuclear family that has the woman at home. We're in a culture war with the Soviets, and so we want to appear morally superior to the Soviets and to the communists. So the Americans worked very hard to have this persona of this more perfect moral family. And so women are really seen as people that only belong in the home sphere at this time. And you can tell this by, pop culture during this time. You can see the images. You can watch, movies from the 1950s and see the way that women are depicted. And take a look at some of these like 1950s ads, right? First of all, who the heck is doing like cleaning in heels, or holding the baby in a full dress while doing the laundry? Yeah, no way. So that, of course, us today, but that was the perception that you had to do that. And I remember my grandmother too, and some of y'all might remember too. She would literally get fully dressed, including hose, every day just to go downstairs. And to me, I'm like, that is crazy. I'm barely getting dressed to do this video. Just kidding. All right, so what was happening with women in Texas? So women in Texas find ways to find their voice. One organization that's formed is called the Women's Committee for Educational Freedom. This is going to be a significant organization because they believe that women belong in politics and a women's leadership belongs in politics. And so this is going to be the launch pad of many very important female Texans like Ann Richards. And they also believe that economic and political democracy would lead to racial and gender equality. There was also a program, there was already a boys state program, which was like this. So there was a girls state program that kind of counters this. So essentially, and I say counter, but actually they were very similar, just one for men and one for women. Basically, girls had to be 17 years old and have a B average, and the intent was to train high school girls to become better citizens, emphasize American democratic principles, and of course this lines up with the image of the Cold War at the time too. But it does launch many women into political roles that will come about a little bit later, which we'll talk about in some future lectures. So I want to talk again about Texas politics and what's happening to this fractured Democratic Party that's happening now. I want to say that LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is on a more liberal side of the Democratic Party. And then there's a new group of Democrats known as the Dixiecrats that are beginning to form. So this is, the Texas regulars actually morph into the Dixiecrats that are formed in the 1940s by a South Carolina congressman by the name of Strom Thurmond. And so their official party was called the States Right Democratic Party. The Dixiecrats are going to be swallowed up into the Republican Party in 1968 with Richard Nixon, but at the time they were just a faction within the Democratic Party. There was a tight senatorial race, U.S. senatorial race, by very popular former Governor Coke Stevenson and Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1948. Now, actually, in the first election, Stevenson won, even though LBJ put on a major campaign and went to like 118 cities in like 40-something days. It was a crazy number like that. But essentially, Stevenson wins, but only by very little. In the Texas state constitution, if the race is that close, it has to go to a runoff. So in the runoff, LBJ wins. Now, this is a very contested issue. There was actually an article that came out in the AP News recently that talked about a man that said it was actually a stolen election. And so, the jury's still out on that, on whether or not he really should have won that race. But his election is very important, and we'll talk about LBJ in our next module 13, quite a bit, because he was an extremely influential senator. He was the youngest Speaker of the House, which we'll talk about as well, I think at the age of 46. And of course, he's going to later go on to become president. He was the vice president under JFK when he was assassinated. So he was also behind a lot of civil rights legislation, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next lecture. But, had he not gotten this, election or, this senatorial, you just kind of wonder, it's like one of those historical what ifs. Okay, but the Democratic Party again was a little bit split because of Harry S. Truman's presidency, and especially because he desegregated the military. So this is what causes the split essentially. And I want to show you this clip here. This is the States' Right Convention platform. And you can see that in this platform it says, "We stand for segregation of the races and racial integrity of each race, the constitutional right to choose one's associates, to accept private employment without government interference, and to earn one's living in any lawful way." And so you can read the rest of it, okay? But basically what I'm telling you here is that this is a anti-segregationist, anti-union form of the Democratic Party that was formed. The Dixiecrats were, and of course I'm blocking this so I can't read the whole thing. And it does split the Democratic Party, but not enough that it causes Truman the election, because he does narrowly beat Dewey. And you can see that in this, and I'm going to show you this because I'm cutting off Texas there. But this is where we're going to end this lecture, essentially taking a look at this very divided political landscape that's occurring. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about African American and Mexican American early civil rights, some other events that happened during that time period as well, some other economic shifts like offshore drilling. But we're basically going to talk about what happened when Mexican Americans and African Americans began pushing back and getting their political voice in the 1940s and 1950s.